Was geht ab? Danke. I'll start with a video.
My interest in art, I think, does really go back to my childhood memories and my father's work, which was furniture making. My parents are really open to anything that we wanted to do. They didn't necessarily say, here's what you guys should do. They just said, here, this is what you have in front of you, just do whatever. I would say they were really sort of atypical Japanese parents. And naturally, I think both of them had a large influence on me. And quite frankly, my parents, I don't think really know what interactive design is. Actually, to be honest, I don't even know what that is. In the late 90s, when I finished college, my brother and I wanted to move to New York, so we decided to move together. And we got this tiny one-bedroom apartment in a three-story house in Williamsburg, and we shared a bedroom back then. Did my brother have effect on my success? I would say none. I think I found my brother pretty annoying, and I'm sure my brother felt the same way. But at the same time, we were there for each other. It's a weird dynamic, I have to say. It's very difficult to kind of describe. My brother tends to be the mean one. He's full of sarcasm, to say the least. But then at the same time, I kind of sort of sense or know his thinking without really sort of articulating it. His desire for sort of like making it perfect, I think it really does reside in the back of my head. Which, yeah, sometimes it's good, but sometimes I just find it so annoying. So, Rei, I really want to congratulate you. I think you've earned it and your hard work. And at the same time, I really want you to remember it was because of me.
So, just to make it clear, I just wanted to prove that what Nina was saying about my twin brother is true. And that whole video wasn't really about me, but about my brother, who happens to be my twin brother, as you probably saw. There was no special effects done in the video, so it was very cheaply made. Very cheaply. The topic of today's conversation, as Nina kindly introduced, is this notion of art and code, which may sound a little bit new, but I don't really think it's that new of a concept. But before I get into this topic, I wanted to start with something that I think is fundamentally inevitable for all human beings, regardless of age, culture, profession, education, something that is a universal truth for all mankind. And the next clip that I'm pretty certain that you've seen, because it came from Germany, as I understand it, represents this universal truth about human beings.
Motherfucking world in my new band is called CCO.
Fantastic, fantastic. I think this is the first time that I've been able to show that video to the audience who actually understands what he was saying. So what is that truth? Let me show you something else. This is a graph that plots something from 2005 all the way to 2013. And it shows these two lines. One that's at the bottom that's fairly consistent at about 18 out of 100. Another line, the blue line that's on top, goes from about 40, goes all the way up to 80 around 2009, 2010, and it stays up at 80 or 70 from that point. This graph and then the previous video that I showed are related. And again, like I said, they represent something that is inevitable, universally true to all humankind. And you have a guess? Something that's completely unavoidable, no matter how successful you are. The black line at the bottom represents the word success. The blue line on top represents the word failure. This is essentially a keyword search graph that's been, whenever anybody types in the word success or failure, and Google Trend basically plotting the keyword trend of those two words, failure and success. What's really interesting about this graph is that there are a couple things. One, people are way more interested in searching for failure than searching for success, right? And number two, from around 2009, 2010, the interest in the word failure went way up. And if you think back 5 years ago, what happened in 2009, especially in the US and especially in New York, is that the financial market had a crisis, and the market collapsed. And from that point, people's interest in the word failure or the topic of failure started to increase, and then it actually stayed at that level. So that universal truth that I was talking about is really this notion of failure, right? Failure is something that regardless of how successful you are, how well educated you might be, how rich you might be, it's something that you cannot avoid in order to succeed. Speaking of failure, there's a quote by a very famous engineer named Thomas Edison, I'm sure you recognize him, who said, "I have not failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." Thomas Edison. I have not failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work. When you look back in history, and when you compare people like Thomas Edison with other titans, other legends, other geniuses of various industries, there are some parallels that you can make between these types of people. So to your left is Thomas Edison, in the middle, as you might recognize, Einstein, and to the right is Steve Jobs. What I found quite interesting about all of these people is that although they might be known for the main industry or the main expertise that they might have had, so in the case of Thomas Edison, he was one of the greatest inventors in history. Einstein, probably the best physicist in the 20th century, if not in history. And then to the right is obviously Steve Jobs, whose product we all love to use day to day, even in our pocket. All these people, I think, have been able to combine two separate industries or two separate interests that they had, and then express them in a way that was cohesive. So for instance, somebody like Einstein, whose primary work is physics and his contribution to the science world, he was also a musician, as you might know. He was a fairly accomplished, fairly skilled violinist. He was taught music by his mother when he was growing up. And I was reading his biography not too long ago, and what was really fascinating was that the way he approached his scientific and physics problems was as if he was approaching music, and he wanted to express his scientific formulas in an elegant, simple way, as if music might. And then, Steve Jobs, I don't need to mention that the fact that he was able to combine design and technology in such a seamless way. So to get to the topic that I wanted to talk about, this notion of on code, as I said earlier, I don't think is a new thing that we've discovered. I think it's been something. It's something that's been around for a long, long time. And even, say, 150 years ago, 100 years ago, when Thomas Edison was inventing light bulbs and other things, or Einstein when he was coming up with these scientific formulas, or as recent as Steve Jobs in the past few, past few decades, when they were creating these, when Apple was creating these objects that combined creativity and technology, science and art in a very seamless way. But I just wanted to use that lens and sort of reflect on our industry a little bit to think about how we are used to working in an agency world, in a marketing world, in a design world, in the creative industry, and sort of started to think about how we could evolve from this point. So to just look back a little bit, wanted to trace back how the marketing and the advertising industry has been working for the past few decades. So when you look back at, say, 2010, and I think 2010 was probably a pivotal year in that a lot of the traditional ways of marketing things started to shift towards a new way of marketing. So in 2010, 4 years ago, the last World Cup was about to happen, and this is, oops. Oh, there you go. Oh. Are we good? Bust it up. Are we good? All right. So, or you can almost see, anyways. So this was a very, very famous and successful campaign from 2010 from Nike that, in my opinion, and in probably many people's opinion, it was probably the best, quote-unquote, integrated advertising campaign. There was a very well-executed, very beautifully done TV spot. There was a series of campaign elements, whether it was a print campaign or an in-store campaign or other things, that were very sort of well orchestrated and well integrated with each other to send a message, which is Write the Future. And when you think about the way these advertising campaigns have been working for the past few decades, is essentially relying on a few different types of channels, something as old and something as simple as print media all the way to the left, to something like radio, which has been around for almost 100 years, to TV, to computers, to mobile phones, right? So the way advertising has been working is to take advantage of these media channels, create a message, and send that message through these surfaces. So that's 2010. And let me rewind the clock back a few decades from 2010, perhaps to the time, maybe a few years or maybe a decade or so before we were born, all the way back to 1959. I'm going to show another clip, which is more recent than 1959, but sort of representing that era.
They also talked about a deeper bond with pride, nostalgia.
So I think there's some technical challenges. Oh, there we go.
They also talked about a deeper bond with pride, nostalgia. It's delicate.
Little over dramatic. So that was Mad Men. Have you seen Mad Men? Has everybody seen that scene? Yes? No? Yeah? Very famous scene. And although it's a fiction, it's reflecting what's happened in the late 50s and in the 60s, which is considered to be the age of creative revolution, especially in modern advertising. And as you might recognize somebody like Bill Bernbach, who is one of the titans, another titan of the industry, and famously created pieces of advertising like this one, Think Small. This is when Volkswagen was introducing the Beetle in the United States, and his agency was the one who created this iconic advertising. Take a product, come up with a simple, memorable, catchy phrase to advertise it, to make people remember and buy. And back in 1959, 1960s, the choices of media were a lot simpler than what we have, but perhaps somewhat similar in that we had print, we had radio, and perhaps TV was when it was making waves in the living rooms. So that's 1960s, about 50 years ago from this point. So let me rewind from 1959 a few more years back, but this time not just a few decades, but a few hundred years, so about 550 years ago from now. And this may be even closer to home for the German audience, in that was when the Bible was printed for the first time. 1440 was when Gutenberg is credited with inventing or perfecting his printing press, which he used to print the first pages of the Bible. And at that point, the choice of media was a lot even simpler than what we had, in the 1960s. In that, print was really the only medium. And I would consider that time, the 15th century, 1440, around that time, is sort of the birth of mass media. And what I wanted to do was to take what I just went through, what happened more recently in 2010, what happened probably about 5 or 6 decades ago in 1960s, and what happened all the way back in the 15th century, 1440, and make parallels in terms of how a message has been communicated to a wide range of audience. And by the way, although I'm Christian, this is not a lesson in religion. I'm just using a way how a message was distributed to make a point. So for instance, and again, this is drastically oversimplified or made simplistic, but in the case of, say, a religion, it doesn't have to be Christianity, but it could be Buddhism, it could be other types of religion. The way that I think it's worked is that there's usually a belief, right? And that the belief may be, hey, there's God, right? And in order to distribute, or in order to make that belief believable, what we've done as human beings is that we've created a story around it. Whether it's a true story or not, I'll leave it up to you guys to decide, but we would create a story around a certain belief. Hey, there's Jesus Christ, there's Buddha, there's so-and-so, and then the family around it, and the followers behind him and whatnot, right? And then we would take that story, and we would find a way to distribute it to a wide range of people. So in the case of the Bible, that's when the story of Christianity was printed on some static medium and multiplied by as many as possible, and then distributed to a wide range of people. And that's how, if I may call Christianity a brand of religion may have established. And again, this is not a lesson in religion. I'm just using that as a way to make a point about how how a message or story was distributed. So using that simple formula, if I use that as a way to sort of reflect on other types of things, and by the way, I'll get to that last point in a minute. But in 1960s, for instance, right, Volkswagen that I was showing you, the thing that they were trying to make famous was the product, VW, Beetle, right? They created an expression around it, which is think small. and then used different types of media channels, whether it's print, radio, or TV, and then multiplied it as many times as possible using those media channels in order to sell more, right? And then that became a business in the 20th century. And in 2010, a few years ago, the same sort of formula, let's say Nike, write the future, come up with a story around it, use same types of media channels, print, TV, radio, TV from analog TV to a flat screen TV, computer, mobile, and then now we have a thing called social media, right? Multiplied by the number of people you can reach through social media. And then the currency of, say, 2010 and forward isn't just business, but it's about creating connections. Make sense? Follow? Good? Yeah? Just making sure. So as you can see, between those three completely separate times, the 15th century, 1960s, and 2010, although the right side of those equations have gotten more complicated, the left side actually hasn't gotten all that different. So the way we human beings have been approaching advertising or marketing in general is essentially two things. On one side, it's been about storytelling, right? So we create a story around a certain belief. And on the other side, it's actually been about technology. Print is an analog thing, but back in the 15th century, it was as cutting edge as it could ever be. And those of us in the marketing, advertising, creative industry found a way to monetize technology as media. So I know this is overly simplified, but that's sort of the formula that we've been following, not just the last few years or few decades, but a few hundred years in order to create awareness and create a belief in a product or service. I just wanted to switch gear a little bit and talk about horse's ass. Does anybody know a relationship between a horse's ass and a space shuttle? Anybody? No? So let me make that connection, right? So, horses have been around for centuries, even potentially longer than human beings. But probably in the past few hundred years, human beings have found a way to rely on horses to transport things and transport people. And way back when, we created these wagons, right? And what's interesting about these wagons is that, they have these wheels, but the width of these wagons were actually based on the width of a horse's ass, right? So the width of horses behind determine how wide the wheels of a wagon should be, right? And then from that, maybe a decade or centuries later, we started to create these railroads. These rails were based on the width of the wagon that came before it, which was based on the width of the horse's ass, right? You follow? All right? Then the railroad actually influenced the size, the width of a locomotive, right? And the locomotive influenced the size of the tunnel, because the tunnel needed to be high enough to be able for the locomotive to be able to go through those tunnels. And then from here, I'm going to make a leap to space shuttle. But what's interesting about the way the space shuttles were designed was that they were designed so that they could be transported from the factory to the space station, right? But in order for that to be transported, it would be carried on a train, which would have to go through a tunnel. Make sense? So that's the relationship. So what I'm saying is the design and even the size of the space shuttle was either directly or even indirectly influenced by horse's ass, which came many, many centuries ago. And the point between the last few slides that I just showed and the way advertising has been working is that perhaps not everybody, but a lot of the industry is still working in a way that was influenced, 5 centuries ago. Make sense? Yeah. But in order for industries to make a leap, you actually can't be relying on what's come beforehand in order to make that kind of innovation and make that kind of leap. So one of the examples in a completely different industry that's happening in the transportation industry to make a parallel with the other trains is that these are the sketches that were released, I think, about a year or so ago. And this is from a company called, it's a company that's started by Elon Musk, who started Tesla, right? And he's creating what's called the Hyperloop, which is a transportation system in California. And this is a sketch for the transportation system for San Francisco to LA. And those of you who may have been to California, if you want to go from San Francisco to LA, if you drive, I think it's probably about 5 or 6 hours or so. If you take a train, it's probably about 3 or 4 hours. But he's creating this train that actually goes between those two cities in 45 minutes or less. And the way he's being able to do that is to not rely on the railroad system that's actually existing in California. Because if you do, the physical limitation of those railroads actually limit how fast the trains can go. So he actually took advantage of something completely, that was new in order to be able to go faster. So the point of this model that I've been talking about, in many ways, the way that creatives have been working in the so-called advertising industry, the way that we've been working was established, 60, 70 years ago by this man, Bill Bernbach. And he was very clever to combine art directors and copywriters, put them in a room, come up with a catchy tagline and beautiful imagery that went with it in order to come up with an idea that becomes advertising. So hence art and copy. But the irony, and as you saw in the earlier clip from Madman, Kodak, who had been around for centuries. They started, I think, in 1883. And Kodak was in the business of making film, right? Make rolls of film that capture imagery, and you save those photos and you send those photos and whatnot. But what they didn't realize a few years ago, maybe a decade ago, was that not only were they in the business of making film, they were in the business of making imagery. And not only were they in the business of making imagery, they should have transformed themselves into the business of sharing images, right? Because in this day and age, if your image is not shared, it probably didn't exist. And a much smaller company, who uses Instagram, by the way? Oh, not as many as I thought, actually. Who uses Facebook, actually, out of curiosity? Or if you use Facebook, Instagram is now part of Facebook. So, Instagram is a company that started 2 or 3 years ago by these two guys. And the guy on the left, Mike Krieger, is an engineer by trade. The guy on the right, he studied engineering, he studied business, but also he actually started his career in advertising. His mom was an employee at an agency in Boston, which is where he's from. And the first job that he had was working on campaigns at that agency. So somebody who had sort of the technical know-how of how to build a piece of software, which was Mikey, combined with somebody who understood the art of talking to people, the art of spreading a message, art of creating awareness, and then combining those two things, art and code, to create something like Instagram. So, art and code isn't necessarily a new way of making advertising, but art and code, to me, is a new way of making new connections. So, on that topic, just wanted to share a few things that I've learned in the past couple of years or so, and making parallels between two fairly different industries, but one industry I think is sort of dominating in terms of creating the future, which is the industry of technology, as noted by startups. And I've shown this clip at other events and other conferences, so you may have seen this. But in the last probably about a year and a half or so, I had a chance to talk to a few different people, including Kevin from Instagram. So all the way to the left. The guy in the middle top is Chris Sacca, who's a very, very influential investor in Silicon Valley. On the right actually happens to be his wife, but she was an art director at various notable agencies in the United States. All the way to the left, Cindy Gallup, who used to be the CEO of BBH in the US. Now she's doing her own startup. The one in the middle, at the bottom, is Hashem, who also was in the agency world, but recently he started a company called Didi. A couple of years ago, started a company called Didi, which stands for Design and Develop, and it's a startup incubator, so to speak. And all the way to the right bottom is Sharon Fetter, who is one of the leaders of Mashable, one of the early technology blogs that's been enormously successful. So the question, sort of deciphering the notion of art and code and how the marketing world can learn from the technology world, and perhaps what the technology world can learn from the marketing world. Just wanted to share a few excerpts and a few quotes from the interviews that I've done with these people in the past year and a half.
No. Sure. A very strong no, and then a more quiet yes. No, advertising agencies should categorically not act like tech startups.
I think that tech startups are facing very different problems day to day.
One of the fundamental problems with the advertising industry at the moment is that advertising agencies are acting too much like everything else they can possibly
So as you saw, people have different opinions whether ad agencies or agencies should act like tech startups, and there are different ways of arguing about it. I wanted to show another clip from Chris, who, when I spoke to him, I definitely sensed very, very strong skepticism from him towards the marketing and the advertising industry. But he did have some good, very precise points that I think we can learn from. So specifically from him, just wanted to show another clip.
In Silicon Valley, in New York, startup culture is about building something for the long term and owning equity as a result. So startups don't pay themselves very well because they own a big piece of the action. The idea is, let's build a product that will actually stick around long enough and generate enough use that maybe we can raise more money, or maybe we can sell this and it'll do well. The ad agencies work for cash, and so they have a much shorter term window. Cash compensation is what killed the record labels. It's what's screwing with the studios right now. It's what made the entire mortgage industry fall apart. And people are incented to perform in the very short term and don't have any stake in the long performance. They make very short term decisions. Ad people spend money like nobody's business. I mean, you fly first class, you stay in the fanciest hotels, you eat sushi every day, and that's why talkers float to the top. That's why really interesting magicians float to the top. Guys who can give the right quotes and give good talk. Those are the guys who run these agencies, right? Because there's no fucking data to back any of the assertions. Yeah. I mean, tech keeps scoring. With TV, you can fake all of it. With radio, even more. With print, Jesus. So, yeah, it's a business that just it instinctively rubs me the wrong way because it just seems so empty on the measurement end.
So the point he's making is that all these talkers who come up on stage, they are magicians. So don't believe what they say and do. Yeah. And just to bringing back to the original point about this transition from uncopy to uncode. And I was talking to Nina earlier in terms of the way we tend to work and the types of people that we tend to have. And what's kind of difficult about that is that the way we hire people has gotten way more complex than it used to be. Because, A, the nature of the business is changing quite drastically. And then because the nature of the business is changing quite drastically, the request that we get from our clients is changing, every 3 months, every 6 months or so. But you can't quite keep hiring or keep changing staff every 3 months, because if you do, you can really, run a successful design business. I was thinking about, what types of people that we like to hire, and I think the fundamental shift that's happened between, say, the 20th century and 21st century is that the 20th century, especially for the agency, design agency, ad agency world, it was somewhat ruled by the thinkers, people who can come up with ideas, and then they would outsource the making of things to production companies, other people to make it for them. But what's happening in the 21st century is that I think it's shifting to the culture of making. So from the culture of thinking to culture of making. But in addition to that, not only people who can make, but who can think at the same time, people who can think and make at the same time are the ones who can succeed in the 21st century, because the interval between thinking and making, what used to be, say, 3 months to go from ideation to making, or sometimes even longer, is now you can do it essentially in a day, go from ideation to at least a prototype in a very, very condensed amount of time. So the types of people that I like to look for, and the people that tend to succeed, are the ones who can think and make at the same time. So just to wrap up, just wanted to show one more thing, or just talk about one more topic. and bring back to the original topic of failure, because that's how I started the conversation and how I wanted to conclude. And I wanted to share my personal failure. As I said, failure is something that's completely universal and something that's completely unavoidable. And I wanted to share my failed situation that happened to me maybe about 12 to 13 years ago. And again, this is another story that I've shared in the past, but I used to play football fairly avidly. And when I was teenage, I played football pretty enthusiastically, and it's something that I continued to do after I graduated and after I started working. This is not a football. This is an eyeball, as you can see. And the reason why I'm showing this image is that I had an injury while playing football maybe about 12 years ago. And that injury was that I got hit with a soccer ball or football on my right eye. And to make a long story short, the retina, which is this film on the back of my eye, came off. And I lost my eyesight completely in my right eye. And in order to go through the surgeries, what I had to do was that after you do the surgery, what I had to do as a rehab process was to look down like this so that the retina can be pressurized by the gas in your eye to stabilize that piece of film in the back of your eye. And first I thought I'd only have to do it for a few days or so, but what the doctor told me was I had to do it for 2 weeks after the surgery. But then I had to have the surgery 4 times, or 4 or 5 times actually. So that 4 times, 2 times 5 was 10 weeks out of about 6 months or so that I was in the rehab. I had to have my face down like this 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 10 weeks, right? If you have a way to make somebody fucking insane, that's the way to do it. I mean, I thought I was like really fucking losing my mind. And I was probably, probably about 23, 24. And, I wish that I would never have to go through that again. And I wish that none of you would have to go through. But what I learned from that failed experience was that, I wasn't playing well, so I got hit, I got injured, all that kind of stuff, was that that was by far the most difficult, mentally difficult and physically difficult experience that I had to go through. And everything else, no matter how tough the situation got, how tough the client was, how difficult the assignment was, everything seemed easy in comparison to the injury and the rehab process that I went through. So to wrap it up, you can forget everything else that I said about art and code and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, what keeps me going and what keeps a lot of people going, I think, is really the sense of optimism, right? So, even the very, very small thing that we might do, there is a chance to influence one person, influence 100 people, influence 1,000 people. And if they can sort of spread the goodwill, then that can be 1 million people, 10 million people, or potentially 1 billion people. But that sense of optimism, I think, is one of the most important things in business.